Okay, perfect. So welcome everyone to the second day of the conference and the first session for today, which happens to be the second session on the topic of COVID pandemic and development and jobs. So much looking forward to the very interesting lineup of 6 interesting papers. So just a gentle reminder for everyone to make sure that they are muted during the presentations. And if you have got any questions, please feel free to place them in the Q&A box. And I'm going to make sure that I'm going to convey the questions to the presenter. We'll start the first session, the first presentation with Daniel Prinz. Daniel, the floor is yours. I've got 10 minutes.
Thank you. Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. So I will get started. I'll be presenting our paper, The Early Labor Market Impacts of COVID-19 in Developing Countries, Evidence from High-Frequency Phone Surveys. This is joint work with a few World Bank colleagues, Melanie Thomas, David Newhouse, Amparo Palacios Lopez, Ulspap, and Michael Weber. So what we are doing in this paper is that given that COVID-19 has caused severe economic damage and governments have responded to decrease the size of this economic damage, and most of the evidence has come from developed countries, we will start thinking about what the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic may have been on jobs in the developing world. Now, in the developing world, you don't have much administrative data, and there are few surveys that allow for cross-country comparison, and there's a high degree of informality, and this is where our surveys will come in handy. So what we do in this paper is use harmonized high-frequency phone survey data. We have currently data for dozens of countries, mostly from Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, though a few countries from other regions will pop in, and these are harmonized to facilitate cross-country comparison, though of course there are some issues. What we document in the paper is that labor markets were very much disrupted in developing countries too. About a third of respondents reported stopping work. A fifth of them, of wage workers, reported lack of payment for work performed, and many people change their jobs or lose at least some income in their households. And then what we do in the final part is that we show that while in Latin America, job losses measured in these high-frequency phone surveys are correlated with macroeconomic estimates, that's not the case in Sub-Saharan Africa. We are not sure why that might be. It could be due to higher levels of informality in Sub-Saharan Africa. But for sure, this really highlights the value of using surveys, trying to understand the on-the-ground economic impacts much quicker than macroeconomic estimates can do that. So the surveys that we use are phone surveys that have been carried out in many countries since the beginning of the pandemic. Most countries that I mentioned that we focus on come from Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. They're harmonized both ex ante in their design and then also ex post. Analysts try to make them comparable, but of course some differences remain. The first wave of these surveys were carried out last year in April to July, but these are ongoing. And at the end of the presentation, I will mention some more recent work that we have done to study the evolving impacts of COVID-19. The key outcomes that we focus on are stopping work, partial or no payment for work, changing jobs, as well as reduced household income, including total and by type. We will compare these to macroeconomic estimates from the IMF World Economic Outlook, and kind of we will try to quote unquote estimate the macroeconomic impact of COVID-19 by looking at changes in projections, what the IMF thought 2020 would look like, and then what it actually looked like by October 2020. You can check out this data on the World Bank's website on the COVID-19 high frequency monitoring dashboard. It's quite cool, and it's obviously being updated. There are ongoing updates being published. The main issue in our paper that you should be mindful of is the issue of representativeness and weighting. So there are some sample selection issues. Obviously, in developing countries, particularly in very poor countries, not everyone has phones or even electricity, and there is different willingness to participate. There are conventional survey weights in our data, but there is also the more serious issue of sampling differences across countries. In some countries, household heads were surveyed. In others, it could have been any member of the household. In Sub-Saharan Africa, they use pre-existing surveys, while in Latin America, they use random digit dialing. We do some additional adjustment using some benchmark surveys like the GMD, but we think there are limits to cross-regional comparability, but there are still kind of variable within region comparisons to be made. So the first kind of result that we document is that a lot of people stopped working in these early months of the pandemic, and these are really much higher than kind of unemployment estimates released by the ILO and other organizations. On average, this is a third of workers in our survey stopped working, but it ranges very widely. It's quite high in many Latin American countries, followed by kind of SSA countries, and kind of the lowest in East Asia. Of course, at least among the countries that are in our sample, but really quite strikingly large impact on stopping work. Now, not all of this is people kind of permanently losing their jobs. The vast majority of these people are kind of people who were not able to work, but were planning to return to work as soon as kind of the pandemic allowed that, and we can only measure this in Latin America, but that's in fact what we find is that most of it is kind of what the workers were themselves considering temporary work stoppages. There is also many wage workers, right, who are an important kind of sample of our data, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, who were still working but were experiencing a partial or no payments of the wages that they owed. On average, this was 20%. In most Latin American countries, kind of between 20 and 30%. So this is kind of even further beyond many people stopping work. Many people were working but not getting all the wages that they were previously getting. We also find evidence that people were changing jobs in these early months of the pandemic, kind of to respond to what was going on. On average, this affected 9% of workers kind of through the different regions. This is again, of course, best measured in Latin America. There were kind of important cross-sectoral heterogeneities. So about 22% of workers stopped working in agriculture, and of course, much larger share of workers stopped working in industry, and also in services, which is perhaps not shocking because services obviously require much more face-to-face interactions. We also find some heterogeneity across the self-employed to the extent that we can measure that. That's, again, is best measured in Latin America, where about 45% of them stopped working, with somewhat less among employees, about 40%. Again, this is a comparison that really we can make for Latin America. So finally, as promised, what we do in this paper is look at macroeconomic projections compared to our measure of kind of labor market impact, and we will kind of take the share stopped working variable here. So the x-axis shows the change in the 2020 World Economic Report projection made first in October 2019, and then the updated projection in October 2020. So this is a measure of how much the IMF thought the kind of macroeconomic outlook for different countries changed. And the x-axis shows the share of workers who stopped working. And here there is a statistically significant and quite visible negative correlation. So the countries where we measure large labor market impacts are also the ones that suffered big economic losses in terms of macroeconomic projections. Now this is non-existent. This relationship is really just not there in Sub-Saharan Africa, which suggests that to the extent that you believe our estimates from these high frequency phone surveys, it may be that macroeconomic estimates really don't capture the on the ground economic impact in the sub-Saharan African region. So let me conclude by summarizing what I have shown you. So COVID-19 had a severe negative economic impact on labor markets in developing work, both in terms of stopping work, reducing working hours, partial and or no payment for work. And we also find that labor market disruptions resulted in severe in income losses, which is particularly striking in these countries where there's a lack of social insurance compared to the developed world. We find that these measures of labor market impacts are consistent with macroeconomic estimates in Latin America, but not so much in sub-Saharan Africa. Could be because of the higher importance of the informal sector in sub-Saharan Africa. But for sure, this highlights the value of high-frequency phone surveys in uncovering quote-unquote on-the-ground economic impacts of kind of ongoing crises. Now, of course, there could be also issues with GDP measurement, both in general, during normal times, but especially during COVID-19, that could be affecting sub-Saharan Africa. And I should also emphasize that, of course, there could be issues in the surveys too. It's always hard to know which one is the real kind of on the ground truth. Finally, I wanted to highlight that this work has been ongoing since we released this initial paper on the early labor market impacts, and we have recently published a jobs watch brief on the evolving labor market impacts of COVID-19 in developing countries that I would encourage to find on the Verdant website. And what we do in this new brief is to analyze the evolving labor market impacts, showing evidence of substantial recovery throughout different countries, but also some sectoral reallocation, as you would expect, as labor markets respond to reopening, but also kind of the new economic realities of this. Well, I don't know if I can say post-COVID-19 or still COVID-19 world, but it is unfortunately still the case that many labor markets and households remain hurt by the COVID economic crisis. So I'll stop here, and if there is time for questions, please ask me questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Daniel, and thanks for keeping up with time. We have got a question from Samir asking about Latin America and why it seems to be the most impacted by the pandemic, by the COVID-19 lockdown. Was it because the lockdown was more stringent in Latin America compared to other regions?
Yeah, so certainly there are a few different reasons. It could be the more stringent lockdowns. Is probably the most likely reason. Of course, these countries are more kind of urbanized and more reliant on kind of industry and services relative to say sub-Saharan Africa. So these sectors are also, as we have shown, more impacted by COVID-19. So I think it's likely to be a combination of these things. And also, I should say that early in 2020, when these surveys were done, COVID-19 did not appear to be as severe, like the pandemic itself did not appear to be as severe in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the lockdown measures were not as severe. Now that have, of course, changed. Now the pandemic is really going on in Africa too.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Daniel. We move on with the second presentation by Livia Alfonsi from University of California, Berkeley.
I am going to share my screen. All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see my screen? Okay, great. All right. Thanks, Ahmed, and thanks, Daniel. Good to know that this does report out on the evolving situation. You'll see why. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Today, I will present joint work with Mary and Sarah on the gendered impacts of COVID-19 on young workers in Uganda. All right, let's see. Okay, all right. Okay, so studies on the early effects of the pandemic have documented that women, especially lower skilled ones, lost their job at a higher rate than men. However, as far as we know, evidence on the persistence of these early effects does not exist yet. And additionally, evidence on the gendered impacts of COVID in sub-Saharan Africa is scarce. So in this study, what we do is we leverage a panel data set for 700 young and skilled Ugandan workers. And we document some new facts. First, we find a rise and persistence of a gender gap in employment in what we deem, in what we deem to be an especially influential group within the Ugandan workforce, where a gender gap did not exist to begin with. Then we unveil a loss in human capital accumulation and productivity among those women who managed to remain employed. Third, we document a widening of the earnings gap. And last, while trying to understand the reasons behind all these findings, we also find suggestive evidence that differences in childcare responsibilities play a role on top of differences in sector of employment. Okay, great. All right, so Uganda implemented one of Africa's strictest lockdown. When I talk about national lockdown here, I'm referring to the very first one because they actually implemented a second one more recently. But this was, as you can see from the timeline, is April and May, so 2 months nationwide total lockdown in 2020. And we interviewed our respondents 3 times over the course of 2020, so January, July, and December, and we're currently conducting a new follow-up. All right, so the 700 workers are young, highly skilled, and highly successful at least at baseline. So in January 2020, they're 25-year-olds on average. 58% of them are male and 45% of kids. They're skilled, as in they're graduates from extremely high quality vocational training institutes in Uganda. They went through a 2 years post-secondary education vocational program. And on average, they graduated 4 years before the baseline, so 5 years ago. So the program is a standard training. It's the Uganda National Certificate Program. It teaches specific trades. And at the end of it, you get certificate of skill ownership with national validity. So the workers in our sample graduated in 10 sectors, like for example, plumbing, hairdressing, motor mechanics, welding, and more. And all the sectors taken together constitute a source of stable employment for around 31% of young workers not involved in agriculture, of course, in Uganda. So clearly this is not a a sample representative of the entire population of Ugandan workers, but we think it's still a really interesting sample because it allows us to see what happens to what is arguably the most kind of productive segment of the country's labor market. All right. Okay, so in the next 2 figures, I'll illustrate you the main findings that we have so far. So first, here in this figure shows how the average employment rate evolved by gender over the course of 2020. So you can see that prior to the pandemic, employment levels between female and male workers were nearly identical, around 85%, so pretty high for a youth population in Uganda. So by May 2020, the employment rate almost halved for male workers and dropped even more for female workers. And it generated this novel gap that didn't exist before, as we said. And importantly, and sadly, this gap persisted even in December 2020. And this is 6 months after the end of this total lockdown and when most of the restrictions were lifted. A curfew was still in place, but most of the other restrictions were lifted. Okay, the lockdown affected female workers disproportionately, also once we conditioned on being employed. And so Daniel just talked about sectoral reallocation. Here we what this figure seems to show is that female were kind of hit more by this reallocation. So what this figure shows is the average share of workers employed in the sector of training for female and male workers over the course of 2020. And again, before the pandemic, let's say January and March, before COVID hit Uganda, if you want, this share was pretty similar across genders. However, female workers' probability to be employed in the sector of training substantially dropped in May, so during the lockdown, and was still significantly lower in respect to the males one in December. And it's quite worrisome if you think that these female workers were, I mean, as their male counterparts, are highly skilled in the sectors. And as I said before, went through it. I mean, the training we're talking about is 2 years, like pretty intense training. Okay. And then the third result concerns the earnings gap. So here you can see that there is a pre-existing gap. So even before COVID hit, there is an earning gap, a gender gap in earnings. In May, only a few workers that resumed employment, as we saw. And so the standard data is the data points are just too large to allow us to say anything sensible. But if you look at December, it seems pretty clear that the gap is in earnings is increasing again. This is conditional on being employed. All right, so why these restrictions seem to have had a bigger effect on women, and also why does it seem that women are failing to catching up with their pre-pandemic employment levels? So basically, in the second part of this study, we try to answer these questions, and we in the paper we look at different factors that could help explain what we see. And here today, I'm going to show you basically the two that seem to be playing a major role. So the first one is definitely the sector of employment. So similarly to what happened in the rich countries, also in Uganda, the female-dominated sectors are hit more. So here in this figure, I'm plotting these sectors in which our workers were employed at baseline along 2 dimensions. On the x-axis, you have the share of female workers that each sector was hosting, again, at baseline. And on the y-axis, you have the share of closed businesses during the lockdown. So that's the first line, like kind of the blue line. And then 1 month after the end of the total lockdown, so July 2020. And so the first thing you can see is that economic sectors in our sample are highly segregated by gender. This is not characteristics of our, this is true at the national level. And second, you can see that both during the lockdown and 1 month after, the share of closed businesses in female-dominated sectors, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the one on the top right corner, were basically more likely to be closed. The share is higher, the share of closed businesses. Okay, so the second thing that I want to show you in terms of understanding why and what could be driving this is the childcare responsibilities by gender. So here you see basically so these 2 graphs are showing you the pre-pandemic January and March differences, which are statistically non-existing between mothers and fathers, or male and female, with kids and with no kids. But then if we go, I think if we go look at what happens after COVID, especially if you focus on the December 2020 figure, you can see that while known mothers appear to catch up with female pre-pandemic employment levels, mothers with 1 kid, or even worse, mothers with 2+, in reality, 2+ kids are less likely to be employed than non-mothers. So I mean, the key takeaway for this presentation, for this study, is that even in populations where it seems that the gender inequality is not that deep employment-wise, the progress is made can be set back by temporary shocks. And yeah, this is all on my side. I think I'm almost out of time, but if there are questions, I'm very happy to take them. Otherwise, you're always welcome to shoot me an email anytime.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Livia. We haven't got questions on the chat box, so I'll take the opportunity and give you a couple of questions. The first one is related to the attrition and selective attrition. Have you encountered such a thing, and to what extent this could have implications for the results?
Yeah, thanks for your question. So we had, so the overall attrition from the very beginning to the end was 24%. So we had some significant attrition. I mean, considering that these were phone surveys and during, the highest attrition was exactly right after the lockdown. But the attrition is not differential by female and male. And the main driver of the attrition seemed to be ownership. I mean, not the main driver, sorry. The main predictor of attrition seemed to be ownership of a smartphone. So I think, again, this was a phone interview. We did as much as we could to collect as many phone numbers from the respondents. But I can tell you that the treaters don't look different on any other, on any labor market dimension at baseline and on any gender dimension. So I don't think it's a major issue for the like gender angle that we're looking at.
Yeah, and regarding the children and childcare responsibilities on women, do you have some like institutional information about how long the schools were shut, and like, because usually in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, you have like this concept of extended family, so I can send my kids to my mother-in-law, for example. So I'm not sure to what extent actually like the actual shutdown of schools and daycare facilities could have direct implications in this particular context.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I can tell you that in this survey that we currently have in the field here, I think if you can see, we're collecting more and more detailed data. I called it household composition, but we're really asking, we're really trying to get at who's taking care of the kids, who was taking care of the kids, and if there are external nannies. And so we're trying to kind of go a step, like, deeper into this question. The schools were mostly closed anyways. It did, just to answer the first point, an institutional, up to December, most of the schools were still closed, especially the lower levels, which is where likely the children of our respondents are still pretty young would be, if any, like going. So yeah, you might want to think of this as the schools were still closed as of December 2020. Yeah.
Very good, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we move on with the third presentation. Robert Hill from University of Cape Town. Robert, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I hope everyone can see my screen and hear me. Okay, so basically I'm going to be talking about a paper that I did with a colleague of mine, Tim Kohler, at the DPRU at the University of Cape Town, and we are looking at the distributional effects of COVID-19 on gender wage inequality in South Africa. So I'm going to start off by just giving a little bit of background to do with COVID-19 and the South African economy. And to start with, I'm going to talk to you about the lockdown. So on the 27th of March 2020, South Africa introduced a 3-week nationwide lockdown that subsequently got extended on the 9th of April. It was extended to the 30th of April 2020, and then thereafter we've entered the sort of risk-adjusted lockdown strategy. So we started with this hard lockdown in March and April of 2020, and now we've got a risk-adjusted sort of changed lockdown procedure where we've got a more open economy at the moment. So that we can see that during lockdown, or during the initial hard lockdown, only those who were instrumental to the pandemic response were allowed to continue working, as well as essential workers like health workers, industries that couldn't economically be shut down, like mines and steel mills, for example. And we can see that as a result, South Africa experienced massive employment losses. And we see these large negative employment changes during lockdown. According to our official quarterly labor force survey, this was equivalent to about 2.2 million job losses in that first quarter up to June 2020, which is approximately a 13.64% drop in employment. Around the world, we've seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has been termed a Shecession, where it's been impacting women more than men. And Collins et al. Found that in the US, women with children have reduced their working hours between 4 and 5 times as much as men, leading to a 20 to 50% increase in the gender wage gap, which ties into the comments being made in the previous presentation about childcare impacts on gender gaps in the labor market. These reduced working hours, it has been posited that they can have long-term impacts on inequality, because reduced working hours now could lead to lower chances of progression in the future, for example. And in South Africa, Kasala and Posel report that 80% of women and 65% of men indicated spending more than 4 extra hours on childcare during the lockdown. So we can see that the childcare burden has fallen disproportionately on women rather than men in South Africa as well. Alon et al. Find that only 22% of women could work effectively from home in so-called telecommutable occupations compared to 28% of men. So this difference in the ability to be able to work in a so-called telecommutable occupation could also be driving changes in the gender wage gap as a result of the COVID pandemic. To talk to you about the data and the method that we used in our study, we used the NIDS-CRAM, which is the National Income Dynamics Study Coronavirus Rapid Mobile Survey, the first 2 waves. This was a telephonically administered survey that was a follow-up of a large-scale panel survey that was run up until 2017. In 2020, then a subgroup of that group was followed up on and interviewed telephonically. So we've got information on their coronavirus or lockdown labor market outcomes. The periods that we have under analysis here, we've got a pre-lockdown period, which is February 2020, and we've got a what we call during lockdown period, which is June 2020. There are now subsequent waves of data that are available that we could use to augment this research, but for the purposes of this paper, we only look up to June 2020. Any earnings data that were collected, we adjusted for any outliers and for bracket responses. So for people who responded in brackets rather than with point estimates, we reweighted them, and we've deflated all of our figures to April 2021 rands. For reference, US dollar was about 14.90 rand at this time. So April 2021, you're looking at every 15 rand more or less is $1 US. And we also opt to restrict analysis to those of working age. In this case, that is 18 to 64, because of the fact that we followed up on a group from 2017. We don't have anyone under the age of 18. We followed up on adults defined as those aged 15 plus from 2017. So 3 years later, they are aged 18 and above. And these people of working age needed to be employed at the given reference period for their wages. So this results in a pooled cross-sectional sample of 2,590 individuals in February 2020 and 1,735 people in June of 2020. And if you look at a sort of a panel sample of individuals who were employed in both periods, you get approximately 1,382 individuals with data. The estimation method that we used, so the one thing that we've picked up on is that estimates at the mean do not necessarily tell the whole story. So we also investigate the gender wage gap across the distribution using recentered influence functions as proposed by Firpo et al. This is the functional form of the regression that we are using. The recentered influence function is used on the quantile function in order to make sure that we are getting this across the distribution. We include a number of individual demographic and labor market characteristics in X, and our estimate of interest is beta, which is the estimate on the female dummy at any point along the distribution. So there are concerns that arise that the samples in February 2020 and June 2020 are substantially different, particularly because women were more likely to be impacted by job loss as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. So we report 3 different sets of results. The first set of results treats February and June as independent cross-sections. The second set of results reweights the June 2020 sample using the Donato, Fortin, and Lemieux reweighting technique to make the distributions comparable over observables. And the third is restricting our analysis to a subpopulation of individuals that are employed in both periods. In other words, looking at what we could call a balanced panel sample. So onto the empirical findings. To begin, we can see in this table on the left-hand side, in panel A, we're looking at the cross-sectional samples, and in panel B, we're looking at the so-called panel sample. And the main takeaways from this table are, number one, women's employment levels fell by a greater rate than men's. So you can see the number of women who were employed relative to men, and then this is in February and this is in June. We can see that the difference in women's employment is greater in June than it was in February. There is a wage gap that exists in both periods. So we can see that women's wages, these are monthly wages, are lower in all periods. And these wage gaps that exist are slightly larger for the panel sample. You can see that these estimates are slightly bigger in the bottom panel. The wage gap does seem to have widened during lockdown. We can see that the wage gap was approximately 3,900 Rand in February compared to 4,600 Rand in June, compared to the panel sample where it was about 4,000 compared to 4,980. We also see that there was very little change in weekly working hours. So we can actually see, if you're looking at the weekly working hours, men were at about 39 compared to 41 and 36 compared to 39. So we see that although weekly working hours don't seem to have moved in the way that we expect, there's definitely been a big change in the childcare gap, where women are exerting an awful lot more time to childcare than men in June compared to in February. So it's 5.34 hours more per day than men, compared to 1.65 hours more in February. If we look at Mansurian estimates of the gender wage gap, we see evidence of an increase in the conditional monthly gender wage gap from February to June. So we can see that these estimates increase. The cross-sectional samples show increases from 37.4% to 51.2%, while the panel samples show an increase from 33.8% to 47%. So either way, a deepening of the gender wage gap. Similar results hold when we consider hourly wages. If we look at the gender wage gap across the monthly distribution, we can see, in summary, for all the constructions, for all sample constructions, the gender wage gap exists in February and is statistically significantly different from zero. The point estimate for the gender wage gap in June, the second column in each panel, is often deeper than for February, particularly at the bottom of the distribution. And if you look at the difference between if you look at the difference in the gender wage gap at each point in the distribution, regardless of the sample, all estimates are very comparable and they follow a similar trend. In particular, the largest widening of the gender wage gap occurred amongst the poorest quarter of workers and for those around the median. And practically what this means is that workers in the bottom 25% were impacted at least 2.7 times more than those in the top 75%. Hourly wage estimates are similar, but they show a greater incidence of inequality for the bottom 25% of at least 3.3 times the value for the top 75. So very briefly, in conclusion, evidence has shown that COVID-19 had a particularly negative effect on women's labor market outcomes around the world. In South Africa, women were also hit harder than men in terms of job loss, and we find that the gender wage gap at the mean has widened by approximately 37%. It's now over 51% in June 2020. Across most of the distribution, the widening of the gender wage gap has been insignificant, except below the 25th percentile and around the median. And the gender wage gap increased proportionally much more for those in the bottom 25% of the distribution. And these results are fairly robust across various sample constructions. The large increase in the gender childcare gap may be impacting women's earning ability, but in our case, we suspect that this is through a factor other than working hours, perhaps through a productivity change or something similar. And maybe policies that support women with children, like the child support grant, could combat this widening inequality. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Robert. We have got one question from Achkar Omarov regarding the channel. So regarding the wage gap, what do we know about peer groups? Are we comparing the same occupation, same industry, same years of experience and education? Was it concentrated at certain points across the wage distribution? So can you elaborate on this?
So what we did is we were controlling for a lot of those variables in our regression. So for example, occupation. So there are certain issues. I believe it is the sector of employment, but there's one of those that is not included in the data for the first wave. So we can't make a comparison over time, but we did check. Including it in our wave 2 estimates doesn't change our results greatly. But we do control for sector and we do control for years of education. We do control for all of these things. Experience is a problem because we don't have a granular measure of years of education. We've only got categories, and so trying to construct an experience variable causes collinearity problems with the education variable. So we can't do that, but hopefully when the Statistics South Africa survey is released with wage data in about a year's time or two, then this will provide a way of doing exactly that in more detail.
Perfect. We have more questions, but we are going to postpone those till the end of the
Sure.
So now we move on with Sam Jones from UNU-WIDER. Sam, the floor is yours.
Great, many thanks. Let me just bring up my presentation. Hopefully it will slowly come together. Didn't seem to work. Let me try that again. It's very strange. Oh, there we go. I hope you can see it. So good afternoon, and thanks for being here. I'm pleased to give you a presentation today of some recent work with my colleague, Eva Manique, who is an excellent Mozambican researcher, part of our team down here in Maputo. Let me start with a summary, just in case the internet dies or we have a power cut. So we know that the vulnerable households have been hardest hit by COVID-19. We've heard that already. In Mozambique, consumption poverty estimates suggest that they might have increased by 10 percentage points due to the pandemic. World Bank High Frequency Survey shows a 30% reduction in employment amongst urban Mozambicans. So here we're interested in looking at a part of this story, which is how has the crisis affected the supply and demand for informal manual freelancers? And to do that, we use proprietary data from a digital labor market platform called Ishgat that I'll talk about in a minute. And what we find is that this admittedly fairly niche market has been resilient and may well have supported the adjustment of some workers to the shock. Okay. So the context is of COVID-19. I think it's worth pointing out that it's not just an economy-wide negative demand shock. What we're seeing is complex effects on both the demand and the supply sides of the labor market. We all know that certain industries have been affected more than others. And in fact, there's actually widespread evidence now across many different contexts of changes to the composition of demand as well as the mode of delivery. So just some examples from the emerging literature. We have, for example, the obvious one perhaps is the shift to online food purchases, and a study in Taiwan showed how these online food purchases increased with the number of cases. The boom in home improvement and DIY segments is also well documented. And in South Africa, a website, a similar website to Ishgat, kandua.com, recorded a 750% increase in job requests from April to March 2020 to 2021. So drilling down to what we might call the informal labor market services, I think in many countries, not just the developing countries, a lot of labor services applied informally. I'm really talking about cash in hand, task-specific activities. Many of us will be familiar with car repairs, DIY, but also extend to a whole range of things, including hairdressing, cooking, and so on. So particularly important in low-income urban settings. So as a thought experiment, we can just think, well, how might COVID-19 affect these markets on the supply and the demand side? So we think there's at least four here. The obvious one is perhaps fear of infection, and that would certainly generally reduce supply and demand for this kind of activity. Second, we have formal business restrictions. So that could be closing certain businesses, reduced working hours, and so on. So on the supply side, it's not clear exactly whether that would increase the supply of informal workers. And similarly on the demand side, the idea here is it could push people out of the formal sector and into the informal sector. Reduced mobility also has a potentially ambiguous effect on the supply side, but could well increase demand for this kind of work on the demand side, in the sense that people now at home may have an increased demand for certain services, just like DIY services. Income loss, we believe, could well increase supply. For example, individuals losing their jobs in the formal sector could well therefore try and find work on the informal side. On the demand side, it's ambiguous. The reason is that although incomes may be reduced on aggregate, it may be the case that individuals shift demand from higher quality formal services to lower quality or more competitively priced, perhaps, informal. So the net effect, like many things in labor market, labor economics, is ultimately an empirical question. So what do we do? So we look at Ishgat. There's more details, of course, in the paper. Ishgat is a digital labor market matching individuals who want a specific service to individuals offering those services across 18 different professions, and it's location specific. It's a free-to-use platform covering freelancers. It's not formal. It's not formal market or anything like that, and it's available both online and using USSD. So it means you don't require a smartphone. There's to date 50,000 workers have been registered on the platform and around 30,000 unique clients. So what we do in the paper, we focus on the aggregate level, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So we're not looking at specific impacts on individuals, but rather what's happening to aggregate demand and supply on this platform. So we look at three outcomes: changes in the number of registered workers, the task contact rate, and the task agreement rate. So this is just very quickly to give you a sense of the trends in all of those in those three outcomes before and after COVID. So 0 is the first case in Mozambique when basically restrictions came on board. We can't see anything dramatic here, although I would just draw your attention to perhaps a slightly downward trend pre-COVID in the contact rate and the agreement rate. So in terms of empirical strategy, so we're interested, as I said, in the demand supply, and what we're interested also is that how did these different channels operate? So to do that, we proxy these different channels individually via a number of different variables, including the number of cases, the restrictions based using the Our World in Data index, stringency index, the Oxford Stringency Index, Google mobility data, and regular monthly data from the National Statistical Institute on employment outlook. We extend the baseline model in three directions, adding unit-specific trends, removing the pre-trend, which is a strategy where you essentially estimate the trend only using pre-COVID data and then extend that forward, and also an event study analysis. Again, I can't go into all the details here, but the paper is available. This, just to give you a sense of these proxies for the different channels, I think it's worth noting a little bit in other contexts, is that certainly in Mozambique, we saw a big rise in stringency, so quite harsh restrictions in the early phase, although there were relatively low cases. These restrictions did moderate over time, but we also see a reduction, a trend reduction, in fact, in employment and also mobility, the worst of which coincided with the second wave, which you can see clearly on the graph here. So the main results, again, time is lacking, but I just want to draw your attention to a couple of points. So here we have, if we look at the top panel, the baseline model, we have columns 1, 2, and 3, the super columns there, those are the different outcomes, and the sub columns A, B, and C are the different trends. Different trends don't make so much of a difference, so we don't need to spend much time there. The real point here, if we just look at, for example, the change in workers in super column 1, there's clearly differences in terms of the different channels operating. So we see a negative response to worker growth, so that's registrations, as the stringency increases. But we see we also see a negative response to the employment index. So that means as the employment index fell, the registrations increased. So that is exactly what we expected according to the channel, where people were moving more into the informal segment as employment conditions changed. So the advantage of an event study is that we can also look at the net effects and also dynamics. So here we have the event study results for the change in workers. As we can see, as expected, the so-called parallel trends, although it's not really parallel trends in this case because we don't really have a treatment group, but we don't see any dynamics differing from the prior trend in a sense in the earlier period. And then we have a small bump at the beginning of the COVID, so from 0 and 1, a reduction, and then an increase towards the end of our period, which coincides with the second wave. Similarly, we have dynamics with the agreement rate. So again, a bump associated with the initiation of the harshest restrictions, some leveling off, and then another increase in the second wave. So we find this is a very interesting study, consistent with a priori ambiguous impact. We do see a varied set of responses, both positive and negative, operating through multiple channels. What we find is that worsening general employment outcomes appear to have shifted workers onto Ishgat and stimulated demand in some way. Overall, this adds up to a zero net effect on the growth of registered workers, but a large increase in the demand for services, suggesting that this could be due to some flexible or the greater flexibility of informal labor services and the possibility of finding cheaper offers. So what can we take away from this more generally? Well, we recognize that the Ishgat platform isn't representative of Mozambican labor market in general, even in urban areas. So it's difficult to draw some very widespread policy recommendations. However, tentatively, we would suggest that these kinds of digital matching platforms, and remember, it doesn't require net access or smartphone, can help labor markets adjust to shocks, even in low-income settings such as these. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sam. A quick question about the heterogeneity. So have you managed to look through the different activities? Like we're talking here about 18 different economic activities, and I was wondering to what extent you have variations across those activities in terms of like the impact of the pandemic. Also, right. Like for the group that has been working already before, have you got historical data about their performance before and their rate, for example, their evaluation, or the earnings they have earned before? And could you check any heterogeneity across these lines? Like, you know, those who have been successful before the pandemic are keeping on and continuing achieving success, or vice versa? Or,
yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, we do some basic heterogeneity analysis in the paper, looking across different kinds of professions. Initially, we've looked at professions that can plausibly be undertaken outdoors versus indoors. As yet, we're not seeing anything. We want to expand that, actually, taking into account some of the previous presentations, potentially looking at female versus male-dominated professions. We do have the difficulty with the data is that, of course, we don't have rich individual data in terms of control. So people aren't required to build a huge profile. So we have quite limited data with on individuals. So it makes it a little bit tricky to control for lots and lots of factors. We also do want to look at the individual specific kind of effects, focusing on those who were registered before. So that's definitely an extension that we're looking to do. We haven't done that yet, simply because we haven't had enough time to extend the paper. So these are great ideas. Great. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. We have got some more questions which we'll be postponing towards the end. Now the next presenter is Souleima Achkar from Asian Development Bank. Souleima, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity to present this ongoing work. Let me just make sure that you can see my screen. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, you can see my screen and as well as me. So this is the ongoing work with the ADB colleagues. With ADB colleagues Samir Katiwada, Mia Arau, and Nico Generalao. So in the interest of time, I will just rapidly move through. I'm sorry. Just a second. Excuse me 1 minute, because I cannot actually see my screen if I will try again.
Yeah. We can see it now.
You can see it? Okay. Can you, am I moving through the slides or not?
No, nothing changed. We have got, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you have just to enlarge it. Just make it full screen.
Yes, sorry. Yes, just a second. Should be coming. I'm sorry, this was working just before. Okay.
At the bottom, you will see several icons on the bottom right. The last icon.
Let's. Oh, yes.
There you go.
I'm very sorry. Is it working? No.
Let me know if you want help from our end.
Please, possibly, because it is maybe is it possibly because I tried to change the presenter mode view?
Right.
That this happened.
So Souleima, if you minimize this window.
Yeah. Yes.
There's your presentation.
Sorry, I don't see my presentation.
We see it. Would you like us to share the presentation for you?
Please, maybe. And I will stop sharing.
Yes.
I'm very sorry about this. So maybe I'll just start. So this is work in progress, ongoing work with our ADB colleagues, and what basically, in a nutshell, what we're trying to address in terms of the gaps in the literature is, as mentioned in many presentations, there hasn't been any studies systematically looking at the impact of the pandemic on labor markets in developing countries due to lack of labor force survey data and other sources, hence the resort to the high frequency phone surveys and other methods. Sorry, I'm just waiting for the presentation. Hello?
Give me 1 minute. Hold on a second.
Okay, so I'm sorry.
Les, if this is taking long, probably we can switch the order of presentations and
Okay.
start with the next one. Okay, depending
Sure,
on the,
sure. Sorry.
so.
We can move on to Simone.
Simone, I know if you
are.
Yeah.
Could somebody enable the share the screen button? Thanks. Great. Can you see?
Yes.
Okay,
Right.
perfect. Hi. Thanks so much for having me and for the opportunity to be part of this really exciting panel. So the paper I'm going to present is joint work with Michael Dancois and Kunal Sen from UNU-WIDER and Robert Ossey from the Institute of Statistical, Economic and Social Research, ISER, at the University of Ghana. And in this paper, we look at the labor market impact of COVID-19 lockdowns using Ghana as a case study. So in particular, in this paper, we exploit a very specific policy setting where stay-at-home orders, so strict lockdown measures, were employed in two spatially delimited areas between 30th of March and 20th of April 2020. And those were delimited to the major Accra and Kumasi metropolitan areas, while in the rest of the country, less stringent measures were in place. And this was implemented in the quite early phase of the pandemic. So what we do is we try to find out using the spatial variations, the effect of stringent lockdown policies on employment outcomes in Ghana. And in particular, we will look at how workers have been affected differently, not only depending on the policy stringency level, but also the type of policies that they engage in. So for the study, we conducted a rapid phone survey between mid-August and mid-September 2020, with a subsample of about 650 respondents who were drawn from the Ghana Socioeconomic Panel Survey. And we focused on respondents located in urban areas who had been working outside of smallholder agriculture in the last panel wave. So it was collected between 2018 and 19. So here we're not focusing on labor market participation decisions, but we're focusing on the sample of respondents who had been employed pre-COVID. We will use a difference in difference design for the estimation strategy, and respondents located in districts with stringent lockdown policies in place will be considered treated, whereas those in no lockdown districts will be considered control. And we will further limit this control group, and I'll get back to this in just a minute. So in the survey, we included 3 recall periods. And the first one was February 2020, which is basically the base period before COVID had reached Ghana. Then the second is April 2020, which is when parts of Ghana were under lockdown, which is our first post-treatment period, capturing the immediate effect of the lockdown. And then the second period is August-September 2020, when the most stringent lockdown policies had been lifted, which is our second post-treatment period, capturing the kind of near-term effect of the policies. Our model setup you see here. So Y will be either employment or earnings, the employment outcome for worker I in district D at time T. Lockdown is our treatment dummy. And then we look at the interaction with these 2 post-treatment periods. So beta 2 and beta 3, our coefficients of interest here. And then we control for worker level characteristics and time fixed effects. In our preferred specification, we exploit the panel structure of our model. So we include actually worker level fixed effects to control for any type of time constant, observable and unobservable heterogeneities between workers. And this also captures the location, which is assumed to be fixed for the study period. In order to identify the treatment effect of the lockdown, we need to be sufficiently confident that no confounding events occurred around the same time, which may have had a differential effect on workers in lockdown versus no lockdown districts. And while we cannot exclude this possibility completely, we at least think we can sufficiently rule out 2 of the potential confounding factors that might be of a major concern. So one is the differential effect of the pandemic shock across industries. And we find no evidence for differences in the sectoral composition of the treated districts compared to our preferred control group. And the second one would be workers' behavioral responses to the pandemic generally, say. So we find from other parts of the survey that actually changes in employment were mainly explained by government restrictions, so not by general fear of the pandemic or health concerns. And we also observed that policy relief measures were quite similar between lockdown or treated and controlled districts, with the exception of direct food baskets that were distributed in treated districts only. But those were of relatively little value and really mainly meant to buffer the direct effect of the government restrictions. And we do not think that those were sufficient to actually affect employment decisions. So we're quite confident that we are actually capturing the effect of the policies. Before moving to the results, just quickly, here in red, you see the 2 lockdown areas, which is Greater Accra and Kumasi. And naturally, this lockdown wasn't random. So it was confined to those areas considered as hotspot of the pandemic with the highest population density, and which is why in our preferred control group, we're going to limit the control districts to those which have comparable population density. In the end, we have 19 treated districts and 20 control in our preferred specification. Looking at the results, here focusing on the one with districts above the cutoff value and worker fixed effects, what we find, similar to what Daniel had been showing in the beginning, is that for this immediate period of the lockdown, we have a strong effect on employment. So we see that overall, due to the pandemic, employment dropped from almost full employment in February by about 26 percentage points. And this effect was much stronger in districts under lockdown. So workers located in lockdown districts were about twice as likely to drop out of employment during this initial phase. When we look at this treatment effect by subgroup, what we find is that, like this interaction term, it's mainly driven by workers in informal self-employment. And this is most likely due to the type of activities that they engage in. Because if you look, same thing by industry, what we find is that the largest effect was experienced in retail, which includes street vendors, but also in transport, such as taxi drivers, in hospitality, including tourism industry, and in hair and beauty, so type of very contact-intensive services. This may also speak to the question, I think, that was raised in the chat earlier regarding differences by industry. Nonetheless, what we also find is when looking at this more near-term period up to August, September, is that the treatment effects, so the difference between by policy stringency level, has disappeared completely 4 months after the lockdown has been lifted. Nonetheless, we find a persistent effect of the pandemic overall, so employment levels were still about 11 percentage points lower in August, September compared to February 2020. Looking at earnings, what we see, again, our preferred specification is a general drop in earnings due to the pandemic. And interestingly, we find a positive treatment effect, and we think that this is mainly explained by a type of selection effect in the sense that workers in more precarious forms of work and lower earnings were more likely to drop out of work in the first place. Again, this effect isn't visible anymore 4 months after, but we find a persistent effect of the pandemic overall with a drop in earnings by about 25 to 35%, depending on which specification we're looking at. And when interacting the kind of medium-term effect of the pandemic by other worker characteristics, what we find is that the recovery has been slower again for self-employed workers and also for women, so matching some of the findings we have seen before in the other presentations. We run a number of robustness checks that I won't go into detail here. So we check for the common pre-treatment trends, including the last wave of the GPSS from 2018-19. We check for self-selection due to moving, assuming that workers may have been likely to move out of treated districts. We check what happens if we exclude the city nucleus districts so of the 2 major metropolitan areas, and also check for random treatment assignment. And in all of those cases, our results remain robust. So thus summarizing, what we find is that the lockdown had an immediate impact on the labor market, causing a clear decline in employment. So workers in treated districts were about twice as likely to drop out of employment. However, this gap had narrowed 4 months after. Nonetheless, there's a remarkable recovery. Nonetheless, we find a persistent nationwide effect of the pandemic. So employment and earnings remained below pre-COVID levels. And we think that the pandemic exposed and accelerated pre-existing vulnerabilities, especially with regard to informal self-employed workers and women. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For the sake of time, we move directly to the last presentation. Souleima, are you ready by now?
Yes, I'm here. Will you, Lena, display my presentation directly, and then, yeah. Okay. So maybe, Liv, what I'll do is I will nod my head to move on to the next slide. So we'll just skim. I already wasted enough of your time. I'm sorry. So what we seek to address in this research is a gap in terms of coverage of detailed labor market impacts and adjustment patterns at the country level in Southeast Asian countries due to data availability, of course. So while there have been studies at the country and regional level. There haven't been any country level systematic studies as such. And also on the policy side, while there have been many studies on sort of taking stock of the social protection response in different countries, there haven't been any attempts at assessing these policies. So if you move on. So in terms of the data, we rely primarily on labor force survey microdata, quarterly microdata for Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and biannual for Indonesia. We also use alternative and supplementary sources of data, including data from NSO websites and ADBI's household survey in ASEAN countries. On the social protection and policy response side, we use the ILO's social protection report data from there, as well as the World Bank's Aspire database and the IPC IG social protection responses to COVID-19 in the Global South database. So what we did is in terms of the method, we constructed pseudo panels by sex and age cohorts to follow the progression of the demographic groups across labor force statuses, as well as transitions within employment, so across status and employment categories and from formal to informal employment, etc., across the quarters of 2020. So of course, we disaggregated along different dimensions as well. And following an approach used in the ILO's monitor series, we decomposed total working hour losses into extensive and intensive margins. So extensive margins being job losses, intensive margins being working hour reductions in employment. And we tried to explore what factors correlate with these different adjustment patterns at the sectoral level in these countries. So among the factors we explored is teleworkability. So to what extent did the possibility of remote work help limit job losses in some sectors? So at this point, I should say that our approach has been primarily descriptive, but we hope to go further along these lines in our next steps. So we also juxtapose the policies implemented with the labor market impacts and outcomes that we've observed. And we try to analyze to do a comparative analysis of social protection response in terms of the adequacy, coverage, and the extent to which it sought to fill pre-existing social protection gaps. So our key findings, so if we look here, of course, the impact of COVID has differed across our countries. So on the slide, we have the three most affected countries in 2020 in terms of COVID impact in our samples. So we have Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. You see in peach is in peach you can see the cumulative COVID cases, in red the stringency index, the government stringency index, and then the transition across labor force statuses. And so you could see in green is the job losses, and they peaked in Q2 of 2020, which corresponds to the period of the higher level of stringency of government measures in these countries. So in all our countries, we saw massive exits from employment into unemployment in red and out of the labor force in blue. Only in Vietnam, you see actually 94% of job losses went directly out of the labor force, and this is related to structural issues in the Vietnamese labor market, where unemployment is traditionally very low, and also due to the sectoral distribution of job losses across these countries. As well, in Vietnam, the government stringency was quite high compared to, for instance, Thailand, which had similar levels of cases. So looking at the different age and sex cohorts, we saw that all of them were affected by massive job losses. What we did notice is that men were more likely to go into unemployment than women, and women were more likely to exit the labor force. So as mentioned in earlier presentations, there's potential lasting disruptions to their working lives. So youth in general were disproportionately affected. So here, if you could see the blue bars is their youth employment share in the most affected sectors pre-pandemic, and then the red bars are their share in the job losses. So if you look at, for example, in Vietnam, accommodation and food services, you see that while youth represented about 15% of the workforce, they accounted for 3/4 of job losses. And also, we looked into whether there's any evidence of labor market detachment among women. And what we did see is that although women were more likely to exit the labor market in Q2 of 2020, they were also more likely to re-enter in the third quarter. In the third quarter of the year, but and even to such an extent that in some cases there was an added worker effect where re-entries in the third quarter were actually exceeded the levels of exits in the second quarter. That being said, the re-entry may not be into the same quality of employment. So indeed, while there were government restrictions and strict restrictions prevented labor reallocation in the second quarter of the year, we saw that in the third quarter, as the economy opened up, we saw a considerable shift into self-employment and unpaid family work, as the formal sector employment lagged the recovery of informal jobs. So although women re-entered the labor market very fast, they didn't necessarily re-enter in the same positions they were in before the pandemic. So of course, it's not surprise to anybody they were.
I'm so sorry for interrupting, but it would be great if you could wrap up because we are running out of time.
So of course there were differential impacts across different groups, and looking at the intensive margins of adjustments and correlations with different factors, we didn't see any strong correlation factor. Please, next slide. Yes, any strong correlations emerged, partly because of offsetting effects of different factors. And then we looked as well at the role of social policies, and we found that, although there were big gaps in social protection associated to high informality in these countries, so the social protection response sought to fill these gaps. So the most significant interventions have been expansion of next slide, please, of the existing social assistance programs, mainly large-scale cash transfers. So you see in blue is the initial coverage, and red you could see the expanded coverage in the pandemic. And also we just noted that wage subsidies, next slide please, and played also an important role, but the coverage of the workforce was very limited, with some exceptions like the informal worker program in Thailand. So in the next stage of our research, we just hope to expand our analysis to other countries in the region with no labor force survey, tapping onto other sources of data, and also to find tangible entryways for improving social protection in these countries. And from a longer-term perspective, we'd like to look at the interaction of the pandemic with drivers of structural change in the region, primarily trade and technology, which were already driving inequality there along different dimensions, and see how the pandemic may have accelerated some of these trends. Thank you, and sorry again for the disruption.
No problem. Thank you, and sorry about interrupting, but we are running behind with time, so sorry. Thank you for the 6 presenters. Unfortunately, you are running out of time. Given that we have started like a couple of minutes late, let me take the chance and ask 2 questions that are placed in the chat to the presenters. So we have a question for Simona. Great presentation and paper, thank you. I'm wondering if you explored how sensitive your results were to varying definitions of employment. Of course, conventional definitions, which include absentee workers, those who are on vacation or sick leave, may not be appropriate in a lockdown context. Simona, could you please answer quickly?
Yeah, thanks. I put a longer answer in the chat, but it's basically, so we tried doing this. The problem is that we only collect data in August, September. So there's some recall bias. We looked at whether people perceived the initial break as being temporary or permanent, and we find better recovery rate in those who said the break had been temporary, suggesting that maintaining an active employment relationship made it more likely, but there might be recall bias there. So that's why we didn't report those results in the final version. And we had very few people reporting positive earnings, but 0 work hours of being on paid leave. So we couldn't say much about that group. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect, thanks so much. Last quick question very quickly to Souleima. Did you take into account resilience by sector, which have more tendency to be influenced by pandemic?
Sorry again, did you take into account?
Resilience by sector, which have been more tendency to be influenced by pandemic.
Yes, so we we disaggregated our data along different dimensions. So we found that a lot of the most impacted sectors in our countries were actually those sectors that tend to absorb displaced labor in times of crisis, like wholesale and retail trade, accommodation, and food services and other services. So those that traditionally absorb displaced formal sector labor were actually quite hit by the contingency, by the strict contingency containment measures of the government, and as a result, we had no labor allocation. That is at the beginning of the crisis, and then as the economy slowly opened up, we saw movement towards these sectors, but then again to lower quality of employment.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for the great presentations. Thanks for all the participants for the great questions they have placed in the chat box. Right now we have a break of it was supposed to be 15 minutes, but now it's cut to 7 minutes only. Sorry about that. The time will be taken for setting up the next presentation, which is going to be the first keynote of the conference. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the break.